So yeah, I'm Tiffani Ashley Bell, the executive director and founder of what's called the Human Utility, which used to be called the Detroit Water Project. Sorry. And so essentially, I do nonprofit work, but I'm a Rails developer. And I also happen to live in San Francisco. When you say nonprofit, people are like, what is that? So yeah, wait, hold on. Remote is busted. Actually, in any event, so going forward, 41 million households in the United States have difficulty affording their water bills. And actually, that's utility bills in general. So that might mean things like gas, electric, water, phone bills, and things of that sort. And this comes from the US Health and Human Services Department. The most recent data is from 2011, so it's probably even worse now. But essentially what we do at the Human Utility is ensure that low-income families and elderly folks are able to have running water by essentially just crowdfunding money for them and paying the bills on their behalf. I started this back in 2014 as a Code for America fellow. It was a side project at that point, but it turned into this whole huge thing, mostly because I read about it at one point in the Atlantic and was pretty pissed off about it and decided to do something. So, and the same thing is happening in Baltimore as well. So you can pretty much lose access to running water if you can't afford your bill. And there are tons of people that actually cannot afford their bills. And the people that are just like elderly, they're in between jobs or some other mishap that keeps them from being able to actually pay their bills. And so once we actually help someone with a bill, we just end up designing data-driven sort of solutions for them to avoid needing help in the future. It doesn't work for everyone, but in most cases, people don't actually need to come back. And we really are changing lives through Ruby on Rails. We've helped approaching 1,000 families since we launched 2 years ago, back in July 2014 in Detroit and Baltimore. But what's interesting is that we've saved over 40 houses from being sold under a tax sale because of water bills. So essentially what happens in Baltimore and Detroit and other locales as well is that if you don't pay your water bill, they'll attach it to your property taxes, regardless of what the situation is. So you have lost your job, be elderly, 70 years old, and just living on Social Security, and they will sell your house from under you if you don't pay your water bill. And it's pretty crazy that that happens because in Baltimore at one point, before they changed the amount that it required to sell your house, a little old lady lost her house for $360 that she lived in for decades because she couldn't afford a sudden spike in her water bill thanks to just a leak that she had. So the city actually sold her house from under her for, like I said, $360, which is nothing to most of us here. But if you're elderly on a fixed income and you're a widow, that's a lot of money to you. And it's been pretty interesting just to have some of our supporters. So we are a Y Combinator-backed nonprofit. I always love how like the creator of Gmail took an interest in us and like thinks this is a great thing. And again, it's just been interesting to kind of get their influence on this because Albert Wenger, for example, does a lot around basic income. And I think that what we're doing is kind of similar in that regard, just as far as like, eventually the goal is to be able to provide like a say default level of water for people, just based on like, you know, this is how much you use, and you can't afford the normal rates, but we'll make sure that you have a lifeline amount of water. And again, so this whole talk is premised on the fact that Rails changes lives. And I'm not like, I have a computer science degree and things like that, but I don't, you know, revel in things like design patterns and stuff like that. I like to think about just like how code can actually build really, really important and practical things. And again, I like to think about how like Rails changes lives. It's changed my life. Like before I found Rails, I was doing PHP work, and that was kind of not the greatest thing to be working on. But I found Rails a long time ago because I didn't want to learn SQL, and like Rails prevents you from writing that in a lot of cases. But that was like a long time ago. But again, enough success theater. I want to talk to you just about like how certain things work behind the scenes at the Human Utility. I'll take you behind the proverbial curtain. So essentially, paying water bills is about solving a series of problems. And those are all just sort of like, I guess you call them engineering difficulties and things like that, but just most of them are like communication issues. But here's the site. So this is pretty much the gateway for donors and applicants. And it sits at humanutility.org. And when you call it up, you're talking to an Nginx and Fusion passenger situation hosted on EC2, which is really awesome. And this is the application that people actually use to apply for help. And some volunteers wired this up through React which I know very little about because I'm not a front-end person, but it works really well. And this is also the next piece where people donate. That's also a React sort of thing. But this is our, it's kind of censored out, but this is our internal backend that we use to kind of like help people and things of that sort. But again, one of the biggest issues that we have is that we need to go back and forth with people about their bills, about their situation. And one of the biggest problems we have is how to do that when we're a team of full-time 2 people, a bunch of volunteers, distributed in different places. Like my admin, she lives in LA. I live in San Francisco, North Carolina. I'm kind of a nomad at this point, back and forth to Detroit and things like that. And we would literally be on the phone all day long if we didn't have software to kind of help us talk to people. So one of the things that I really liked about Rails 5, for example, and I was using it kind of before it got released, was just like Action Cable. And so we do a lot with that on the back end. The first place we use it is just in creating notes for people. So when someone applies, usually there's something wrong with their application. They're missing documentation, or they might have fat-fingered their account number for their utility account or things like that. And we have these internal notes that we trade back and forth. And sometimes, I couldn't get folks to use Slack, unfortunately, so this is kind of like a solution for that. So these sort of internal discussions we have are updated kind of in real time. But the next piece is that we have discussions with people about their applications. So like I mentioned before, people will apply and not submit documentation, for example. So when you apply, we ask for things like pay stubs, your lease to prove where you actually live, identification and things of that sort. And so we usually have to go back and forth with people about getting those things from them. And so you'll see here Marie, our admin, talking to someone about submitting their documentation, telling them what not to send and what to send. And thanks to Action Cable, all of this stuff is updated. I wouldn't call it real time, because some people have a problem with thinking that WebSockets and stuff like that are real time. But this is kind of what happens. It's updated, in near real time, I guess. And that's pretty cool. So this actually leads into another piece of the app as far as when these replies come from people. This is actually from mostly just an email conversation. So Marie will email someone through this app, and it will go to their inbox, of course. And then if they reply, it'll actually show up back here in the app. So how we did that was pretty much just using the Gridler gem, which is really, really awesome. And it's actually a ThoughtBot thing, so thanks for that. And that's hooked up through Mandrill, which is MailChimp's transactional email service. And it allows us to suck in emails. And when someone replies, this is the part in just the residence piece that collects a person's feedback. And it also just broadcasts back out to Action Cable. So if you're kind of talking to a person in real time, you'll see replies from them as you're just sitting there, if it's sucking in emails properly. And then this is just some really basic configuration that Gridler requires. And it's super duper easy, which I was really kind of moved by. And again, when you have a person reply, as long as they reply above this line that it says there, then we'll get those responses in our app. And you can kind of set up and tell people through this what to actually reply above. And let's see. So the next piece is Gridler and processing those emails that come in from people. And that's actually our Mixpanel token there. So I have to censor that out. But when we have discussions with people about their situations, again, they can reply. And when it comes in, it comes through this piece of code. And it actually just kind of matches based on secure UUIDs that kind of track the conversations and things of that sort. So when someone replies, the original idea was just to match by emails, but that kind of doesn't help in some situations. But we can just track it through those tokens. And then, of course, it generates this custom email address for each thread. And then that helps keep the conversation straight. Well, one of the problems we're working on, though, is just what happens when someone replies from a different address or from a phone that might cut off the original conversation thread and email. But that's sort of a issue we'll work on in the future. But like I mentioned before, we need paperwork from people. When you apply for assistance, we actually need to know that you actually need the help. So again, we ask for things like pay stubs, leases, and identification. But since we are a distributed team, we don't actually have a physical place to send documentation. And there are places we could send it, but we would probably miss it. So I'll get into sort of a brief digression in this case. So smartphones for many people are a lifeline. And interestingly, there are folks that, like I said, just rely on those. Like they don't have access to broadband in their houses and things like that. And this is how they get access to internet. And I had a conversation, if Greg is here from Twilio, I had a conversation with him and a few other people a long time ago on Twitter about how some people believe that if you're in poverty, you shouldn't have a smartphone. But regardless of what you think about that, which I disagree, but for people in poverty, the smartphone is actually their lifeline to things like services like ours and jobs and things of that sort. And so even this article talks about how smartphones are increasingly playing an outsized role in people's lives. And again, they get access to things like healthcare, job hunts, and services like ours. And on top of that, this is really a thing. So 13% of people that were interviewed in a Pew Internet Research study with incomes less than $30,000 rely on their smartphone for things like internet access. And in opposite case, just 1% of households that are earning over $75K a year rely on their smartphones for internet access. So this is really a thing. And like I said, for many, the smartphone is the only way they can access the internet. I have to drive that point home. And by saying that, this is the only way they can actually access our Rails apps. But back to the point, back to our problem. So one thing that we decided to do with people that we know usually have like an Android or something like that is that you can text us pictures of your documentation, and we'll have that on file, basically. So it's pretty cool because through Twilio, people will send us text messages with just pictures of their leases, IDs, and things like that. And that's automatically linked up to their application through just some of the Rails stuff that we wrote. But the first thing we do is we use the refile gem, which is really, really awesome. I used something else a long time ago, but I found that this was really, really well documented and really, really easy to use. And it allows us to handle both manual uploads and uploads when someone texts us pictures of their documentation. But the first thing that we do, like I mentioned before, people sometimes don't send us their documentation when they apply. So it might be just a matter of just they don't. We found that this is sort of a UI sort of thing. A lot of people don't read the full application. They'll just submit. Even though the button is huge and says, you're not done with this application, they'll push that and then get to the last page and not realize that it says, here's what we need from you as far as documentation goes. So this is scheduled to send them, if they allowed us to, as far as we ask permission on the application, can we text you? But if they allowed us to, we've scheduled just a delayed job that just sends them a minute later a text message saying, you're not done, please send us your applications, your documentation. And we found that that's actually increased people's, actually sending the documentation in. And of course, we need all that stuff for IRS purposes, so it's really important to get that. And we don't actually end up helping if you don't send that, so it's very important to do that. And again, that's just hooked up through Twilio, and it's super simple to put together. Yeah. So we just kind of parse things as far as the message ID and who it's sent from. So it's all matched up through phone numbers. So when you apply on your application, you'll give us your cell phone number. And if you text us from that same number, we'll automatically go through and say, OK, that's coming from Ray. And we'll match everything that you send up to that. And that's all uploaded to Amazon S3 through the refile gem. And we used to have an activity feed in the app, or we still have it, we just don't kind of rely on it. But this also gets broadcast through Action Cable back to that activity feed, letting people know that are looking at the whole thing that, hey, Ray submitted his documentation, so we can work on his case now. And again, this was super simple to set up as well. It's just a matter of just a few Amazon keys and telling it where to put things. But also just setting up the schema to keep track, especially of things like just the URL where it's stored in it in S3. So we can go back and access things later. And it shows up pretty fast, which is great. And again, I love how a refile is just really, really simple as far as just like, this is our document model, and all we do is just add the attachment file method, and then that's pretty much set up. And the next thing you see here is just kind of like updating the file name. Like we found, depending on what kind of phone you use, it'll send different file types. So it might be a JPEG or a PNG, depending on what kind of phone you use. We just automatically kind of set it and make sure that that's sent to Amazon properly. But then also Marie, when she gets documentation from some people, they'll need to fax it to us because their phones don't send the greatest pictures in a lot of cases. So we hooked up our fax setup to just email us the documents that people send. And we don't suck that in through Gridler just yet, but that's coming. But in that case, Marie can just upload these manually through the admin interface, and it shows up just like this. Sorry, it's all blacked out, but it shows up just on the person's profile page. And it turns out, though, that we get over 200 of these messages sent a month where people apply, and then they get the text message, and they actually send us, their documentation. And it's kind of amazing because beforehand, it was just kind of like, where do we accept all this stuff? And the text message situation takes care of that. And it really saves people the hassle of having to get in their car, if they have one in that case, and go somewhere and actually file things. There's a lot of elderly folks that, they can't leave the house, but they actually know how to use a cell phone to actually send us pictures and things of that sort. So then the next and the last piece is just we've begun to start telling the stories of people that we've helped. And that's something that I love this part because it's kind of coming up for air to me because I've been doing so much as far as dealing with government and building out pieces of the infrastructure and actually figuring out the most efficient ways to help people. But this is the storytelling piece. And this is all powered by Jekyll, basically. So it's really just really, really simple templates. Person's picture, the story, which is written by a retired journalist in Detroit. And it shows up super duper simple. And actually, this part is open source on GitHub right now. So if you want to watch this repo and star it and contribute something later, you totally can. And that's kind of my spiel. I think of it as, again, Rails changes lives, and it does something very basic as far as helping us get people water, and I love it for that. So, and again, we're changing lives. So if you want to, you can donate, you can volunteer, you can hack with us. This is the site, and this is our GitHub repo. Thank you.